Hi, Brian Benedus coming to you. Continuing reading my book, Scared to Death, Do It Anyway. I am using a brand new copy since the last copy is pretty much shredded from all the notes and so on. I got a couple of emails asking me to show pictures because I hadn't, and I'm happy because they read the boat. I'm sorry, they read the book. And yesterday was the test. It was a very intense chapter, so I'll go quickly. This was my first boat, the Dream Catcher, and that's the one I talk about in the test. And this is my drum kit. So that's the one I still have actually, and that's at home. So we are now moving forward to adventures in bottle selling, and I will at one point write another book. This could have been, as I said, 50,000 pages long, and this chapter in particular is where I built my business up and so on and so forth. But there's only so many things you can do to develop trust in somebody that is afflicted with agoraphobia, panic, and anxiety. So I got right into it with this, and this will pretty much tell the story of my life. Selling plastic containers. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. Japanese proverb. I have a favorite hotel in Carteret, New Jersey. It's the Holiday Inn at Exit 12, right along the New Jersey Turnpike. It's an okay hotel, I guess, no better or worse than dozens of the other chain hotels that populate the exits along the busy highway. The difference with this hotel is simple. It sits on a hill and has a sign pole that appears to extend hundreds of feet in the air. The sign is so high, in fact, you can see it for miles around. I was able to use that sign to establish a home base for myself whenever I was away from home. As long as I could see that sign, I figured I'd be okay. And that's a very welcoming amenity for anyone who has agoraphobia. I had scheduled an appointment dinner in New Brunswick, New Jersey at Exit 9, which felt like halfway around the world to me. The man I was preparing to meet was a major player providing bottles to the automotive industry. And he invited his son to join us, too, who was poised to soon take over the family business from his dad. This account had the potential to be an enormous and long-lasting one, and I knew I had to make a good impression. But I was worried I wouldn't be able to handle it. I hadn't been to sleep. The anxiety about the meeting had been building in my system for days. I thought I had planned that day out perfectly, too. I was aware I needed to burn off the fear and anxiety in some way, or I'd never be able to walk through the door of the restaurant, and I was thrilled when I found a full-service gym just 10 minutes away. The gym was already served as my sanctuary, and it was where I could really work out my fear and frustration. I needed to exhaust myself and find my focus before this meeting. That's a prelude to the IFT training in the toolbox. I ran through my usual workout routine. It was mid-July. I was tiring and the sweat really started to flow. However, I discovered the anxiety wasn't lessening. It was growing. I then decided to get on the treadmill to run. I ran for over 20 minutes until I couldn't breathe or barely stand up, and I found I was completely drenched in sweat. As I ran, all I could think about was the dinner, the pressure, and remember that's where anxiety does its best work in the future. I tried to focus on my favorite Mark Twain quote. I've had a lot of worries in my life, most of which never happened. But even that wasn't working. I looked at my watch and realized I needed to go, but I also needed to run more. I felt myself starting to go crazy. I hopped off the treadmill and jogged outside into the late afternoon July heat to retrieve my suit from the back seat of my car. My hands were shaking so bad with panic I could barely put the key in the door. I scanned the skyline to see if my Holiday Inn sign would be visible. I knew just seeing it would calm my nerves a little bit, but I couldn't locate it. It was just too far away. I brought the suit back inside and found myself in the ugliest, nastiest men's locker rooms I'd ever been in. I doubt it had been cleaned in a year, and the room was populated by a group of scary-looking muscleheads, all in various stages of undress, who I had to guess had probably never seen a suit before. I really should have gone back to the hotel to shower, but time had run out. I tried to think up a great excuse so I could make a call and get myself out of the meeting, but nothing was coming to me. I turned on the shower and pulled off my work clothes, and some guys I just trained with had just commented how strong I was, walked past me a little too close, and I felt myself spin into a full-fledged level 9 panic attack. Then I had vision. If I didn't get myself under control, I knew I would step naked into the shower, shampoo my hair into a big white lather, then run screaming through the gym, stark naked, out into the street. Imagine what he and everyone else in this tough Rawway gym would have thought. Shit. I never did take that shower. Instead, I just slipped the suit over my hot, sweaty body. I buttoned up my white shirt, now translucent in sweat, knotted up my tie, buttoned up my jacket, matted down my hair, walked back out to the parking lot, and headed for dinner. I was a mess. I wish I could say it was the first time this had happened. It wasn't, and sadly, it wouldn't be the last. I was only about 24 years old, and I was embarking on my first real sales call. My father's best sales guy had quit to start his own company, leaving our entire family's business in utter chaos. Since I fancied myself to be my dad's fix-it guy, I decided I had to be the one to go out and try to sell. I didn't feel I had any choice. So with no training or expertise and a full box of bottles and anxiety and fear, I put on my monkey suit and headed across town to visit a well-established company called Bradford Soap. Bradford Soap was a revered local institution with a 100-year reputation as a leader in the personal care industry. That made an enormous variety of well-known soaps and related products. I hadn't picked an easy first target. I admit I had no idea what I was doing, but after making probably a dozen cold calls, they figured the only way they could get me off the phone and stop wasting their time was to grant me a meeting. And I already knew from the disinterested tone they wanted nothing to do with me. I pulled into the company giant parking lot and turned off the car. I looked up at the massive stone mill building and felt the panic rumble throughout my body. It was only then that I fully appreciated how terrified I was. What the hell was I going to say to this guy? I don't know how to sell anything. Where would I even begin? And perhaps my biggest anxiety was my father. I hadn't told him I was coming here. I was terrified even more of what he might say. I sat in the waiting room boiling in my own juices until I was called in for the appointment. In my mind, I was expected to meet with one buyer in an anonymous, quiet office in the back of the building somewhere. As I was escorted in, I realized there was no office. Instead, I was faced with a sea of 200 cubicles where everybody on the floor could hear and see everybody else. It was a dizzying, noisy maze. The man I was scheduled to meet was on the phone when I got there, so he pointed at the chair in the corner of the cubicle and I sat down. Frantic office activity bustled all around us. The box of plastic bottles I was holding was rattling in my hands as I shook, and I started to worry that with my throat closing so fast, I wasn't going to be able to speak. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. As I waited, I was beating myself up in my mind. I can bench press 400 pounds, and I'm too chicken to talk to this skinny little guy about bottles for 2 minutes. I wanted to play some music and get myself psyched up. Then I'd be able to jump up and scream into this guy's face like we'd all do in the gym. Hey you, buy these bottles for me right now, man. Do it, you fucking hear me? We're cheap and right down the road, and you know what? If you don't, I'm going to kick the crap out of you and your supplier too. If I had done that, I don't know if it would have worked for me or not. They would have asked the man in the white coat to just come take me away. When he hung up his phone, I instinctively stood and reached across the computer to shake his hand. Back in those days, computers weren't the skinny Apple and Microsoft desktops and laptops we have today. This guy's computer monitor weighed about 40 pounds and had 100 wires coming out of the back of him. He also had a 4-line telephone on his desk with a spider's web of wires coming out of the back. As I stood to shake his hands, my left foot got tangled into the wires, and as I sat back down, I sent his massive computer and phone cascading to the floor in an ear-splitting crash of breaking glass and plastic that brought the busy, bustling room to a complete standstill. I can't be sure, but for a split second, my heart may have actually stopped. The man was cool. He never once flinched or even looked at me. All he did was stand and point. get out of my office. My wife Robbie could see the stress and worry in my face. It concerned her, but she read it as the same ordinary stress and worry that any young man might face working around the clock trying to save a struggling business. She had no comprehension as to profound depth of the panic I carried. In those days, whenever I found myself in a CVS or other drugstore, I would spend hours carefully looking at the bottles on the shelves, scanning them for a company address I could use for a sales call. The problem was that with my family being in the business for so long, we knew all the companies in our area pretty well already. It was rare to stumble across a significant company that we didn't have on file, but on this day I got lucky. Autocrat. Autocrat is a coffee distributor located in Smithfield, Rhode Island, that was building a business in the extract market and was producing a coffee syrup that had become insanely popular locally. This was a big account we had not chased before, and they needed a bottle I really wanted to make. I knew we would be the perfect match for them. In fact, it's an account we landed and still service to this day. When I got home that night, I told Robbie about my lucky find and that I planned to visit them the next morning. She was ecstatic and possessed a lot more confidence in my selling abilities than I did. Coincidentally, she even happened to know the account, since it was a very well-known company in Rhode Island, and she had a feeling that this one was going to work out. She knew how an account like this would mean everything to me, to our company, and to our new family. But I looked forward to my trip to Autocrat the next morning with absolute dread. I could feel the anxiety already tingling in my chest. I wouldn't be able to sleep. I feel something terrible would happen. So much was on the line, I was scared to death. I got in the car that morning and pulled out of my driveway for the 13-mile drive from Cranston to Smithfield. I played the theme from Rocky on my tape deck. Then I turned the radio over to something more soothing. After driving a few miles, I pulled over and hyperventilated. I returned to the road and pulled over again a few miles later. I had to find a way to shed this anxiety and irrational fear, which at the time I still didn't understand. I thought I was going crazy. It took me 3.5 hours to travel 13 miles. As I sat in the Autocrat parking lot, my eyes filled with tears, and I started to rock and cry like a baby. No matter how hard I tried, I could not go in. I just didn't have it in me. Even with my family and my business on the line, on this day, I couldn't do it. I don't remember how long I sat there trying to find the will. But with no other alternative, I restarted the car, turned around, and headed for home. The 20-minute trip back to the house was the longest, most painful drive of my life. The guilt was crushing. I had no idea what I would tell Robbie. I figured I could try to lie again and tell her they didn't want us to make any bottles. But I remember she already knew the customer. I really didn't know what I would say or how I would say it. I was humiliated, defeated, and was letting her down in the most possible way. I pulled up to the house and got out of the car. As I walked to the front door, Robbie bounded out to meet me, her eyes wide and full of anticipation. She looked like a child on her birthday about to receive a great present. I stood in front of her, holding nothing but the bottles I had discovered at CVS the day before. "So, are you going to make it?" she asked. "I don't know," I answered. About 15 minutes later, I realized she was asking about the bottles. Those are 3 separate stories. The first story of me in the gym. Again, I can tell hundreds of these stories, and I do at some of my talks and seminars. The wonderful thing about these stories is there's no embellishment at all. In fact, I've kind of toned them down a little bit. Again, the whole thing about this book is to develop trust so people understand. They see vulnerability from a guy who's been very successful, and they realize they came out the other side. But they also see that honest to goodness, there's no other way to put it, but I had it to the extreme. And everybody says they're nervous, and I get it all the time. I get it from my family members, not my family, but people. I remember giving a talk and being nervous, and this goes so far beyond that. This goes back years and years and years of not knowing what the problem was. It's not a fear of talking. It's a fear of having that thing while talking to somebody, not knowing what that thing was. Okay, everybody gets fearful. So the first story is me in 15 minutes. Let's see if I can get this done by 20. Um, the first story is me in my own company, trying to develop and bring up my own company. The company was located, as I mentioned, in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And those things about the gym, I used to go to the gym before I used to go see the customer to relieve the cortisol and anxiety and so on and so forth. I learned how to use my IFT training. So I was on the verge of getting it. But then I actually taught myself how to tunnel vision and how to utilize all the energy into that one specific goal. And to this day, I'm fine. But back then, I could tell you 50, 60 times that I never took a shower before I went to see somebody. But I had to get the adrenaline out of my body. I just couldn't get into the gym, into the showers, be that vulnerable, and not know what's the matter with me, thinking I'm going to run outside completely insane and make a complete ass of myself. The second story is the very, very first sales call I ever made to a company that was literally a couple miles away from my father's company, Lubin Plastics. And he didn't know I was going on the sales call, but this is when, if you heard earlier in the book, Marco, I'll use his name, Marco, started his own company, and I felt that I needed to go out and try and sell. So that not only was the anxiety there, but also acting like, it was like a Jerry Lewis movie. Remember it to this day. Knocked over all his stuff, and it's so embarrassing, but it's real. And the third story is it's a sad story because it's really one of the first times I always had this thing. I always had, but I was always able to fight through it. And I think one of the biggest reasons I wasn't able to do this was because I knew my wife was home, waiting for me to get home to see if I was able to secure this account, which added even more anxiety onto it. Again, not fearful that I'm going to be defeated, fearful I'm going to let somebody down. And my whole life has been like that. That's the guilt. We talked about that in an earlier chapter. That's the guilt factor that comes into play. That shitty word, guilt. And when you put agoraphobia, panic, anxiety, worry, and guilt, and depression, and all that into one little package, here you go. So that's what I was living with. That's a few adventures in bottle selling. And when I give, I used to, I remember I told you at 42 I retired. So for the last 10 years I've been doing pretty much business consulting, but a lot of sales talks and a lot of marketing in my small little area up here in my loft. And none of this was ever spoken about until recently about anxiety, but I teach different ways of selling, and I call it a view from an owner. But it's so easy because to me, not having the anxiety and panic was 80% of my problem. I always say, and I say it again, I reiterate it again, I'm sorry if you've heard it, if I could get people to come into my office or come into my bedroom back then, I could have sold everybody because I just knew what I was doing. I could fix any problem that anybody brought me in the packaging world. So those are just 3 short little versions of what I went through as a bottle salesman. I don't want to harp on it too much because it was self-inflicted. It's something, nobody put a gun to my head. But still, in my head, that's what I needed to do to become successful. And I thank God to this day that I fought and He gave me the will to do it, as well as the tools to get over it. And we are gaining on it. We're almost at the healing thought process. So thank you very much. I'm going to continue to read. So it's a nice day outside, and my schedule is pretty open. So onward. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon.